Hi, everybody. Welcome to the ninth episode of the Postkahanism podcast. Today, my guest goes by Dictators Den on Twitter and hopefully soon on Substack and other channels. He is an expert in obscure 20th century books, which show a very different side of history from both, I think, what we all got in school, but also the stuff you'll get on the alt-right online. So maybe you can introduce yourself.
Hi, Baruch. Thanks for having me on your show. So we have kind of similar interests. I know that you read a lot of some of these older, some of the Bircher or Bircher adjacent books, some of the stuff on just the USSR and how, a lot of this has sort of been kind of whitewashed and just edited, but there's a lot of really good books on just how it actually happened at the time and memoirs and stuff. And I think one of the reasons I started, just watching your content is because you are very interested, that Victor Herman book. It's like the same era that I'm very interested in, people from the West sort of running cover for, Stalinism at its worst. And I guess the stuff that I'm interested in talking about today is sort of the era after that, where they sort of are still kind of running cover for Stalin, but Mao is like a new client. And then eventually Castro becomes a new darling of these same people that were, defending his and stuff.
So I just want to give the audience a little bit of context.
Certainly.
So what's now the alt-right? Well, the ruling right coalition, Trump's team, and I guess the intellectual milieu that is around Trump's team. Curtis Yarvin, for instance, who I had on this podcast, and who was recently featured in a profile interview by the New York Times. This movement, this intellectual movement, started about 17 years ago, I'd say 17, 18 years ago in 2007, basically with Curtis Yarvin just writing a long format blog called Unqualified Reservations. Because until then, the right wing was composed of sort of the Mitt Romney / I guess Little Green Footballs type, right wing blogs, which was kind of like Fox News Plus maybe, and then various more fringe stuff. And so Curtis started writing this blog, and part of Unqualified Reservations would be Curtis pulling up various obscure books from the 18th, 19th, well, usually 19th, 20th century, and then using them as sort of a launch pad to spin off a different historiography, a different view on history, which was really interesting. And there were a bunch of other blogs that came off of that. At one time, Curtis thought that by having people read all these high IQ classic books, it would change the whole perspective, and then somehow that would form the mindset of the new American elite. So there were all these high IQ blogs. Well, there were a few. Facchetti, a guy named Facchetti had a blog who maybe you could describe. And then what happened was sort of the eternal September of the alt-right, which is a term from back when you had bulletin boards and people's access to the internet would generally happen through them coming to a university where they get access. And then every September, you'd have this flood of puerile idiots, on the bulletin boards, and you couldn't talk about anything because you'd have these retard kids on there for about a month of September. They'd come to school, they'd get on the bulletin boards, they'd shitpost, and then they just kind of drop off. And so then Eternal September was when everybody got internet access through AOL. And the average IQ level of the internet dropped by about 30 points. So this sort of happened with the alt-right around 2014, 2015, I'd say. And so you're the only guy that I know that kind of took this idea of we can really change our whole view on reality, on politics, on history by just reading all these primary texts, all these classic books, which are out there. They're on open source. They're in libraries. They're on the internet, but nobody reads them because you need a high IQ and you need a long attention span and so on and so forth. So, right?
I mean, it's kind of funny to find out about any of this stuff. Like, I don't know. I was never participating in any of these forums. Like, I was, this, like, when these people were writing, this was like 10 years ago for Fosetti, who is great. But I was not aware of it then. Like, I found it like years after the fact. So I'm not claiming like, I really admire that guy's blog and a lot of those other people you mentioned, like Yarvin, but I was not active in these communities when you were. I found them later. It was sort of like I found his blog and all his book reviews. And it was kind of funny because you would click links to other bloggers that would comment and now they're dead. Their blogs are scrubbed. It's sort of like an archaeologist finding a civilization and half of the they were trading with this other city state or something, but there's no record of it now. What happened to it? So I sort of am a very late comer. Like, I probably started really getting into this stuff maybe let's say 6 or 7 years ago.
So you're an archaeologist, basically, of the old neo-reaction.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So can you like describe Fossetti's blog and kind of, because it was sort of a flagship of this movement. It's gone now. But can you describe it for the listeners?
What was cool about his blog was that he started out, and I know a lot of people have started out. He was a libertarian. He was into Mises. He was into all that stuff, and I went through a phase where I was really into a lot of the ANCAP stuff, but he started to read Unqualified Reservations. But more importantly than that is, when I first read that blog, I was intimidated by the amount of just links and old books on Google Books. But this crazy guy actually started to read them and review them. And it was awesome because he had a real job. He had a family. Like, he was not just this knuckle dragging. He was just a very intelligent, reasonable guy. And he started he kind of came around that, he started as a libertarian, and he realized, well, this is not going to necessarily pan out. Like, most people have zero interest in Mises. Do not live they just don't, it doesn't work that way. And you can watch his transformation. He just kept reading. I think he read most of the Bircher books. He read, just about every old 19th century primary source on the Civil War. And I started to go through and just read the stuff that he recommended, his reviews, and I was just blown away. It's so amazing that these books still exist and they can be found relatively easily. But I found the Dozen Candles books, and I just I read all of them, and that's printed by Western Islands. Supposedly they're going to reprint them soon. But I also read, I started finding books by Arlington House, Devin Adair, and these authors. One of them I want to talk about today, John T. Flynn.
Just a second. We have to provide some context here. So,
go ahead.
So one piece of context is this movement kind of started because people that were intelligent and that were right-leaning, that were more libertarian, many of them, they saw the way that American politics was going in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and realized this is bad. It's only going to get worse. There's no internal mechanism that's going to make it better. Somehow there's some kind of structural thing that's making it like this. And libertarianism or whatever within the framework of the current system is not going to cut it. You're basically rearranging deck chairs in the Titanic. So they said, okay, well, let's go back and, read all this stuff. And it turns out that the past is a different country, right? It's a completely alien universe with an alien worldview. And even as far back as a few decades ago, the way that people thought and perceived the world was completely different. So when you say Birchers, the audience is not going to probably know. There was something called the John Birch Society, which maybe you can describe a little more, which published a bunch of books, among other things.
So the John Birch Society was named after this American Baptist missionary who was killed in China by communists, and he was just an amazing all-American guy. But basically, Robert Welch and some other people were sort of disturbed by basically finding out. I don't think they fully ever accepted this for the most part, but they basically discovered that the New Deal was just sort of very eerily always aligned with communism everywhere at all times. And the successor governments were the same way. And that things like the State Department were full of shall we say, people who are very friendly to basically the highest body count regimes of the 20th century. And it's not that the Birchers have this weird thing where it's like I think their heart was in the right place, but they're also like far too naive on certain things. And what I mean by that is that, when we talk about like who lost China, for instance, that was a debate. There was all these things like the McCarran committee. There was the Tidings committee, which investigated the State Department. But it's like they can look at this stuff and they are correct that all these people did actions that lost, that made these countries turn communist and have huge famines that killed, tens of millions of people, which is why I was so interested in China, because of how awful the Mao regime was. But they do not ever fully accept like the idea that, that maybe this is just a communist thing with a veneer of whatever, and that this is bigger than like Russia and China. Like, for instance, I can't think of it like a single like example in history where a weaker, less influential country actually dictates the foreign policy of a more powerful, fashionable one. Like the idea that like Russia could just do this and get all these people to do all this stuff for it without like having approval from the highest people in society is to me kind of ridiculous. And that's one thing I guess my disagreement with the Birchers. I think they're awesome. All these books are must reads, but it's like they didn't go far enough in like just taking it to its obvious conclusion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Birchers, like, the way I understand the Birchers was that they were successful American normies who were from flyover country, even if they happened to live on the coast, but they were spiritually from flyover country. And they had this realization that, oh my God, the U.S. government is full of literal commies. Alger Hiss, of course, was probably the most famous one. Harry Dexter White and all these other guys all the way at the top. And so their conclusion was, well, I'm an American. I know Americans. Americans are awesome and Americans are not commies. And therefore, there's some outside power that's infiltrated all these commies into our government. Right. And then, they wrote a bunch of, they wrote and published a bunch of books that were basically, I don't want to say like Alex Jones, but it was sort of conspiracy type literature,
I want to say that the people who wrote, like the people in these Dozen Candles books are often ex-New Dealers. John C. Flynn started out as a New Dealer. So they were not the same as the average Bircher. They were more like ex-elites that defected, like James Burnham, but they're not the same people. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So when you say the 12 Candles, can you give the audience a little bit of a context what you're referring to?
Yes. So this is a book this is a series of books. Wikipedia nuked the page on this, but it's a series of books that involve different aspects of the New Deal organization. Like While You Slept by John T. Flynn, the Web of Subversion, which discusses all the communist infiltration of New Deal, which again, there's France, The Tragic Years by Cicely Huddleston, which discusses the Vichy government and just like how de Gaulle was basically just a puppet. It sort of takes a nuanced view of. There's a book, everyone's heard of Background of Betrayal, because that one they're going to reprint soon, and by Hilaire Duberrier, whose newsletter is also free online. There's one on the Kohler strike, but a lot of these ex-diplomats they became disgusted with just what happened after like Yalta and stuff, and they wrote these books. And the problem is that they got kicked out of the New Deal. They became heroes, and they are heroes for writing this, but they name names, they name committees. They are not slouches. These are guys who saw the sausage being made. And these books are really short. You can fit them, if you have like a shirt with a pocket, you can fit this tiny book and they have beautiful cover art. But they name names, they name committees, they explain who was involved in this loop. And if you read a couple of them, you'll start seeing these very amazing connections. Like, just for instance, you could talk about China just to give you kind of an example, if that's all right. So there's a book called While You Slept by John T. Flint, and it covers the entire Chinese, just the way that the State Department just sold Chiang Kai-shek down the river, and all the different ways that it did so using like just these journalists like Owen Lattimore and like Agnes Smedley and Edgar Snow and all these other people. And they were tied in to this, like Agnes Smedley was tied into this spy ring by Richard Sorge, who was the one who told Stalin from Japan that was going to send troops south instead of north. So that helped him for Barbarossa when he was fighting the Germans who launched that.
Well, Stalin disregarded Zorge's, advice. He thought that Zorge was feeding him this information. He was telling him about the impending attack in Barbarossa. But let's take a step back.
Yeah, sure.
What's kind of the larger narrative that emerges from what's the context? What's the larger narrative that emerges from the Birch books? The Birch books are, a second half of the 20th century, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, right? And so what's the larger story that they're telling?
Okay, so the story that I take from it is that that basically the State Department is always at all times basically coming up with the worst possible outcome that will lead to the most violence, the most deaths, the most just like destruction of a country, because they always want to support the most revolutionary possible regime. And this is a trend you can see in China, where there were like people in the State Department. There were people like John Davies and what was his name? John Stewart Service and John Carter Vance. They all had this clique, and they had a clique where they were trying to filter the information that the American public was getting. They were using these people I mentioned, like Owen Lattimore and Edgar Snow and Theodore White, the Thunder Out of China guy. These books wrote negatively about the Chiang Kai-shek government. And basically what it did is they were pushing to force the nationalists to have a joint government to share power with the communists. Communists don't ever share power. That's not how it works. And of course, Mao and them were getting their orders from Russia, but eventually George Marshall went there, and there's also Bircher books on him. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but the point is that the outcome of all these policies is to basically cause the existing government the State Department doesn't like, which is too right-wing for their taste, to fall and get replaced by a communist government. But what's interesting about this is that they always have so there's a guy named Frederick Vanderbilt Field of the Institute of Pacific Relations. And this guy was basically bankrolling this organization. He is of the Vanderbilt family. He was a communist, an open communist. And he was writing this magazine. And in theory, it was this kind of snooty, highbrow, this is what diplomats read to understand how to view this China conflict and show why what they always said is the Chiang regime is always corrupt and ineffective. Right. And the communist or agrarian reformers, they're it's ridiculous.
We have Jeffersonian Democrats.
Yeah, exactly. We have to. Oh, go ahead.
I'm saying there's kind of a when you look at this story, right?
Yes.
There's kind of it's a story that repeats throughout American history, right? Going back to how did Chinese democracy, right? How did the regime that Chiang Kai-shek inherited? How did Sun Yat-sen's regime, how did it come to power? Basically the same way, right?
Yes.
America supporting the most progressive guys on the scene, right? As opposed to the old reactionary, corrupt regime, right? In Russia, you had the same thing, and if you read, I've read monographs from Columbia University in the 1930s about the Soviet Union and what a wonderful job these people are doing modernizing Central Asia, I mean, they killed millions of people there over the 20s and 30s and did horrible things. But, these guys were PhDs writing monographs and, how these guys are basically, the communists. Well, of course, they have some rough edges, but really, when you think about it, they're basically like Jeffersonian Democrats and so on and so forth. Yes. And you have this narrative being recycled to Iran when they basically Jimmy Carter's State Department threw the Shah under the bus, and the modern days
they called it I think
pulling the chair, right?
Or no, it was Shah rap. That's what the people chanted when the Pahlavis left. I think in Farsi that means Shah gone, but they chanted Shah raft, which I always thought was funny. When I had a boss that would leave, I would always say their name and say raft, like go until raft. So it was like the Shah was deposed, but yeah, it's the same thing.
So, and even if you look at the Obama administration's State Department / CIA's policy towards modern Iran, and I guess the modern Sunni jihadists, it was also if you think about it. Who was the previous Egyptian guy that was there? Mubarak, I think.
Mubarak was the one that was just deposed, and
right.
Morsi came in. Yeah.
Right. So Mubarak, when you think about it, Mubarak is, his regime is very corrupt and ineffective and very reactionary. And Morsi and the insurgents, the people fighting against Mubarak, are really kind of Jeffersonian Democrats. They represent the will of the people. Sure, they have some rough edges, but when you think about it, and then when you look at the recent Syrian events, also, they had who's the head HTS guy? He looks like Zelensky. I forget his name. Also, he's kind of a technocrat. Okay, he used to be in Al Qaeda, and he used to cut people's heads off, but that was a long time ago. That was maybe 5 years ago, or even 6. And now, Idlib is so technologically progressive, and here's some stuff this guy's saying. When you think about it, he's also Jeffersonian Democrat. So it's like the same template gets applied across 100 and I don't know how many years of American history. Why are they like this? What's their thinking?
I think that it's always just ratchets. There's a really good book, and I don't know if I think it was on UR, but it was by the author, and I've probably been mispronouncing names, but the author is Evelyn Waugh, who wrote Scoop. But there's a book called Robbery Under
Law about Mexico, right?
Yes, that's an amazing book. But it talks about the history of Mexican relations with the U.S. going back to I think even Monroe, and some of the stuff that was coming out of the U.S. at the time sounds like the same kind of Berkeley crap. It's just insane. There's always this desire to take whatever stable existing government exists and basically just mess it up. And then they did the same. They kept doing this, though. There was a series of civil wars in Mexico, and then what was the guy's name? Lombardo Toledano was involved with all these weird labor unions. He is a international communist. I forget the name of the government. They had so many of them, but if you read like the early progressives, like Lincoln Steffens, they're like, it almost reads like Chavez, where Sean Penn goes to see him because he's going down to Mexico as a quote unquote journalist, telling what is the guy's name? Carranza. That was the guy, the dictator du jour at the time. He was telling him how to like nationalize the oil wells and steal them from like the British companies. But it's like this pattern. And I think that, I don't think that it almost feels like just automatic and just the same way that things keep moving left. It's like just, for whatever reason, you just cannot have like a competent dictator in the region. It has nothing to do with like I don't know. Okay, like, and a lot of these dictators, by the way, we're talking about Cuba. Batista was a darling.
Sorry, you're fading out. I can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so Batista was a previous darling of Cuba. He was the guy that Castro replaced, but I read this ex-communist memoir. I forget which one. And the person went to some event, and at this time, this was decades before the 50s, maybe this is the 30s, but he was the darling. Like he was considered a progressive candidate then, but he just fell out of favor the same way that a lot of these older people, just like these older people that, got Arab Spring or they were like Naserites or whatever, however degraded it had become but it's like, it's this urge to just keep like sort of sowing the dragon's teeth over and over again. And then Batista wasn't like, I guess, progressive enough. But even if you read his Wikipedia page, these people will just discuss like the Wikipedia pages on a lot of this stuff is fascinating because they can never admit these people are spies or whatever, or just doing weird communist stuff. Like even the Alger Hiss one's hilarious. But what you find when you read this stuff is that you can still get like snippets of truth if you've read, about this like era. You're like, okay, so you're basically, you're just going right up to the ledge and you're dancing around it. But I know you can't say this, but it's very strange. But the point is like, if you're a U.S. client for long enough, you're just going to get replaced is what I mean. Like they're just going to eventually replace you because they're going to find someone better who's going to be, I don't know. It's very
more progressive, more of a Jeffersonian Democrat. So one of the interesting things is that the people that are pushing for this stuff are not wild-eyed, poverty-stricken Sacco and Vanzetti types. You mentioned Vanderbilt. There's Lincoln Steffens, I believe, came from a very distinguished family. These guys tend to either be members of or be close to sort of the oligarchic business elite in America.
Well, I think that they're more, okay. So I read this book recently about Henry Adams and stuff and the people he hung out with, like John Hay and stuff. And they were talking about the Cuban or the Spanish-American War, where they were, and the, I think it was Carnegie. But anyway, a lot of these oligarchs didn't support these wars. They thought it was bad for business. They like this idea that this is just done for money. At the time, even, at the late Gilded Age or whatever, these people often got dragged into it because there would be like weird incentives or pressure put on. Like, I think he eventually changed his tune, but there's this weird thing where the government, even back then, is directing business as to what to do. Like, I don't believe for an instant that, like, if you read about just the way that like Castro and these people destroyed Cuba, they were doing all this terrorist stuff to weaken the Batista regime, like setting fire to sugarcane fields. But, even then, the CIA was encouraging people in like 1957, which is apparently Cuba's top year for economic growth. Like this guy, Earl E.T. Smith, who was the final ambassador before Batista fell, wrote this great memoir. And he's just talking about how like the CIA is encouraging the barracks to revolt. And they're doing all this stuff, like they're taking, people at the Moa mine hostage, the nickel mine. They're taking United Fruit people hostage. And the State Department and the CIA is encouraging them to do this. So I think that like one of these, the people that are doing it are elites, but they're not doing it
not a straightforward business interest.
They're not doing it. Yeah, the United Fruit Company does not control like the State Department. The State Department just does this weird stuff. And these are our elites, but they're way above like, and they're like people you haven't heard of. Like, you know, in China, for
Loose,
instance,
right?
What's that?
Loose. LUCE.
Oh, yeah. That was the Time publisher, right? That was the guy.
The publisher of Time magazine, who was
Whitaker. I think he actually liked Whitaker Chambers' pieces. Like, he was actually like Time magazine used to be like a lot better than it is now. And Whitaker Chambers, if you read Witness, there used to be some oligarchs that were kind of actually like sort of like pro. They were more like, you know, what leftists imagine Americans were like in the past, but they were actually like, you know, somewhat pro-American. For like actually not spreading, you know, communism. But the people, I guess what struck me about reading about this stuff is that the people that are doing this stuff are like the people that made China fall, aside from like Marshall and stuff. There are these weird academics like the Institute of Owen Lattimore, yeah. With Henry Wallace to tour the gulags when Henry Wallace was like a vice presidential like.
So this is a story that we should probably tell for the audience a little bit more in depth. Yeah. So Owen Lattimore was a sinologist. He was a bona fide scholar of China and Central Asia in the 30s, and he published. But he was also a commie. But he was not one of these like smelly commies, you know, stinking up the room. You know, no. He was more of a highbrow. He was a more highbrow academic, and he published this journal called the. He had the IPR, right?
That was with Vanderbilt Field. He was involved in that, yes.
Right, and so it was a little bit kind of like Foreign Affairs is now, where it would be these. Very respectable academics publishing very respectable essays, which would give senior civil servants and NGO types, I guess, something to point at and go, look, academia tells you this and this and this, and therefore we should support the commies and whatever the next step is that they need to take to get into power. So Lattimore also spoke Russian, and one of the things he did was to be kind of an escort and translator for the American Vice President Henry Wallace on his tour of the USSR in 1944. And one of the things
that Gulag tour.
Well, that was one of the things that they showed him. It wasn't just the Gulag tour. They took this guy to the Gulag, and then the Vice President of the U.S. came back and was full of praise about how like healthy and robust all these convicts were and how great they were doing. I mean, this was at a time when, you know, people would go to the front from the gulags and volunteer there to go into penal battalions, which were basically cannon fodder, because at least you get something to eat.
Minefield.
Right. Kind of like the Wagner Group thing today, because you get something to eat. Because the guys that would stay back in the prison camps were dying of starvation. And so, you know, this guy is singing the praises of these convicts who were just a bunch of NKVD guards who just dressed up in convict uniforms and put on a Potemkin village show. So after the war, it turns out that the IPR, aside from providing this kind of respectable academic cover, was also straight up running a communist spy operation.
Yes,
right?
They have. Can I talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I actually read Philip Vanderbilt Field's autobiography because and he is related to the Commodore Vanderbilt. But if you read it, he comes off as very kindly and just sweethearted. Like he's like, and he looks like this innocuous kind of nerdy, nebbish guy. But you know, and when he has to talk to the Tidings Committee, or I think he also talked to the McCarran Internal Security. But he's always like, I don't understand why they're they're going after me. I'm just a nice, all I was doing, the whole point of I was just writing articles about labor in Asia, and these people are thugs, and they're boorish, and oh shucks, why me? But when you read about like the AmeriAsia case, there was this guy named Philip Jaffe, and
AmeriAsia was the magazine that the IPR put out, right?
But they made AmeriAsia. It didn't even have a subscription, by the way. It was not enough readers. It was a spy operation to get stuff from the Navy, from the OSS, and the I forget which agency. Maybe it was. I think it might have been the OSS. They picked the lock for the offices, and they found boxes everywhere of like just documents from naval intelligence, military intelligence, OSS, State Department, and they found the people that were conspiring with Jaffe. And I should add that Vanderbilt Field made the AmeriAsia magazine so that there would have like credible distance from the IPR, which is supposed to be more respectable, even though it was propaganda. It's still, he wanted to go even further. So this was just a spy thing, as you said. And the guy, Jaffe, got like a $2,500 fine, and like the other people in the military who were leaking the stuff. And again, there was like boxes, and it was like a room full of classified stuff. They got slaps on the wrist. And it's just hilarious because if you read Field's autobiography, he just like, he grazes over, like he doesn't even talk about it really. And I guess I just want to say that these things are all connected. Like these people review each other's books in these journals and the New York Tribune, and it makes it seem like there's this like debate and this is the best policies. But all these people like Lattimore, his wife, might review Edgar Snow's book, and then Edgar Snow's wife might review his book. So you think that these books that are saying Mao is the future or Chiang Kai-shek, they're all just review. It's like a big, stupid, like just ridiculous, like circle jerk, I guess you could say.
Well, it's the Truman Show, right?
Yeah. It's a Truman Show.
So this is actually how the Roundtable Society over in Britain and the Dominions used to work as well. Rhodes, the society that Rhodes founded and then became kind of known as Milner's Kindergarten, where these guys they were civil servants and they were academics, and they were all part of basically a secret society that would design British imperial policy going years forward. And then they would promote it by having kind of guided roundtable discussions on a very high level and publishing academic literature that kind of purported to be intellectually open debate and actually was sort of managing the perspective of the audience, where you go, well, look, on one hand, these guys, like China is kind of where it boiled over. So the whole who lost China thing was really where it all came to a head. But it could be any one of, 20 different conflicts where America acts like this. So in China, okay, on one hand, Chiang Kai-shek is bad. On the other hand, the communists are Jeffersonian Democrats. And let's have a debate. Like, what's more true? The Chiang Kai-shek is bad or the communists are good, right?
Yeah.
and then the conclusion is that like Chiang Kai-shek is kind of bad and the communists are kind of good, and we should kind of try to force Chiang Kai-shek like to work more with the communists, and if he doesn't, then we'll cut off his ammunition. I mean, we won't cut it all the way off. He's still our ally. We still love him. He still loves us. We'll cut it in half. Right.
Can I just can I bring up one random thing about this? Cutting off the ammunition was also how Batista and Chiang fell, because what they did. Okay, so when they published this thing on China and they said we gave them $2 billion of aid, what they really meant was that we repatriated a bunch of Japanese people, like POWs.
You're fading out. Say
okay, I'm sorry. Can you hear me better?
Yes.
Okay. When they said that we are giving, like we gave them $2 billion aid and we've been trying to help Chiang, and the idea that we're communists, we're just helping Mao. What they were doing when they calculated that budget is a lot of the stuff that they claim they sent, like the KMT, for instance, used the same cartridges. I think they were 7.92. I'm not an expert on firearms or anything, but it was the same stuff that the German army used. And they had a bunch of this because the Germans had surrendered. And instead of sending it to Chiang, which would have cost the U.S. nothing except shipping cost or whatever, they just Lachlan Curry of the State Department, personally, who was also involved in helping to bring Mao to power, he personally stopped the order, and so it ended up with Stalin, who destroyed it. So Chiang's men couldn't get the ammunition. And then they also had something called Operation Destruction, where they dumped, I believe, 120,000 tons of artillery shells into the Indian Ocean and prevented it from going to China. And what China did get, they sent, they inflated the cost by 30 times what it would have for just other nations trying to buy ammunition. And in Cuba, for instance, they would do stuff like they would cut off. The U.S. would be like, we're not going to sell Batista's regime any more weapons, even though there's this ex-president Carlos Prio who's arming Castro from Florida. He's sending arms down to Cuba from Florida. The State Department and the U.S. let them do that. So Batista's like, well, okay, I'll just buy arms from somewhere else. And the State Department's like, no, we're going to stop that too. You can't do that. And then they say, well, you ordered those 20 armored cars, you paid for them. We'll give them to you if you let up on civil liberties and let some of these communists out of jail. So he's like, okay, I'll do that. And then they're like, after he does that, they're like, oh yeah, we're actually still not going to give you the armored cars. But it's just this weird, just very, just bad faith agreements on. I just wanted to bring that up because I think it is kind of a hilarious thing that you see also where this is how the U.S. treats regimes it wants to change, and it's a pattern.
It's how it treats Israel, for instance.
Yeah.
Right. But it's not. There's usually in these stories there's a lead up, and the lead up takes place over years and maybe even decades, where you build up dependence, where you say, hey, we're going to give you military aid, and we're going to rearm your military with more modern weapons. We're going to give you American training, which, by the way, while we're training your troops, we're going to identify the more promising officers. We're going to recruit some of them. We're going to develop an intelligence network wherever we're doing this, and so on and so forth, and an influence network. And then, oh, you've got rebels. Well, you're going to need more help for the rebels. You're going to need to build up more. You're going to need to get more American weapon systems at a discounted rate, and you're going to need to build up more reliance on America, and so on and so forth. Maybe you have an enemy, so we'll arm them too. For instance, here, everybody knows that Israel is a huge recipient of American foreign aid, but Egypt is getting a comparable amount. Okay, it's the same order of magnitude, and then Jordan on our other side is also getting a huge amount. They're both completely armed by Americans with modern weapon systems. And then once we've kind of got our thumbs firmly on both sides of the scale, then at the crucial moment we're going to go, oh, well, you're having a war. Well, of course you're having a war, because look at all these regressive policies you've implemented. Look at how reactionary and corrupt you are. Look at all these internal political problems. I mean, we'd love to give you weapons. We'll give you some weapons, but we're not going to give you all the weapons actually until you implement such and such changes, which coincidentally make you weaker, make your enemy stronger. And then we'll give you a little bit more, and then we'll make you, will make you implement more changes that make you weaker and your enemy stronger. And this actually happened in Israel during the recent war, where we actually scrapped our ammunition production capability and our aerial munition production capability over decades of cultivated reliance on the U.S. with American encouragement.
I thought that was why the foreign aid thing, or for when they say that, they give arms to these countries, kind of as you say, this is, I think, I thought a big part of it was we'll give you our old stuff. You're not going to have stuff quite as good as us, but it's so you don't develop a defense industry of your own, kind of as you said. I thought that was sort of a Machiavellian reason that they do give defense aid, the Pentagon stuff does it.
Of course.
Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. That's very accurate. And then, of course, it gives us that leverage that at the crucial time we can pull the chair out from under you, and then you're going to sit down, and there's not going to be a chair there, right? And so, you can't even buy the stuff from the people who'd be willing to sell it to you because we've kind of made you reliant on our systems. So this is not every time it's like a new story, but every time it's the same story. So why did China and Cuba? Why did this stuff come to a boil with China and Cuba in the 50s? Was it that McCarthy started making noises?
No, I mean, all right. So for the reason, so there actually is a really wonderful book, and this is the first book I read on this, and I cannot believe that this book was even written because of how just telling it is. But it's called "The Man Who Invented Fidel" by Anthony De Palma.
About Herbert Matthews, right?
Yes, this is a guy, though. He is a New York Times journalist. He probably knows where some bodies are buried. I don't know how he wrote this book. Like, usually, that's why I love the Birchers. Like, these people who wrote Dozen Candles. Am I still coming in okay? Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, now I can. Yeah, you faded for a sec. Yeah. Yes.
But this guy, Herbert Matthews, was a New Deal journalist. And because there was unrest in Cuba, but he went to Cuba to interview Fidel. He was hiding out in, the Sierra Mountains. There was only I think he came on that yacht with 82 people or something like that. But this guy, Herbert Matthews, went to him, and the New York Times is a big deal. And so when Herbert Matthews interviewed him, by doing so, he built him up. And
he made him a celebrity.
Yeah, exactly. And the William Wieland of the State Department was like the fourth floor. That's the name of Earl E.T. Smith's book. They were thick as thieves with Matthews, but Castro himself in speeches, and he admits that, he kind of tricked Matthews and that, he sort of got Matthews to do the favorable PR. But Matthews got Earl Smith's predecessor, a guy named Arthur Gardner, who was the previous United States ambassador to Cuba, who was very friendly with Batista. He got him reassigned. This is the kind of power. The embargo came after, it's sort of like they work together, two fingers side by side and they form a fist or whatever. But Matthews wrote that Batista's days are numbered, similar to what I was talking about with these Owen Lattimore types. And then if you do that enough, what does the American person know about Cuba? They might have family there if they're Cuban, but you could say that Mormons would be the best, government for Cuba. And what does the average American know about Cuba? You can spin that,
especially if they read it. If they read it in a few different outlets from a few different angles,
yes,
then you're creating this illusion of parallax, right? You have something that looks like multiple perspectives on the same thing that's far away, and it's actually it's an optical illusion that you're creating, right?
Yes.
The funny thing is, you mentioned the yacht. So I'm not sure if this was the yacht. It's
called the Grandma.
The Grandma belongs to Ernest Hemingway.
Yeah.
Who was kind of like this, his persona was this kind of salt of the earth,
yes,
manly writer that used to, I don't know, hunt lions and go run around war zones and stuff. And then this guy takes his yacht and moves weapons to Fidel Castro at a time when Fidel Castro has 2 platoons worth of guys. And all of a sudden, Castro becomes this monster and basically eats Cuba alive. And Hemingway is hanging out with Guevara and attending executions for kicks.
Yes. I just read this. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, sure.
This guy, Herman Marx, who is a total cretin. There's a great, I think it's a libtard magazine, but it's called The Atavist. But it's about Herman Marx, who was this sort of ne'er-do-well, just petty criminal in the U.S. He went down to Cuba and he fought for Fidel. And even the Cubans were like, this guy's kind of a freak. But he went down there and he was the executioner. And Americans would go down there like Hemingway, and they would, after Castro took over, he would execute them in front of this Christ statue outside this old fortress. But these liberal American playwrights like Tennessee Williams types would go down to Cuba, and Herman Marx is like, okay, cool, I'm going to shoot some people tonight. You all want to see it. And sometimes they would get mad and he would be confused. Like, well, why did you come down here? Of course you want to. And Hemingway was like, well, you have to understand the human condition. So you have
If
to
you
watch
think about
people
it,
get killed. And he loved watching that. He would make like mixed drinks and just watch Marx execute people.
A Cuba Libre, sure. Well, if you think about it, Marx was basically a Jeffersonian Democrat at heart.
Yeah.
He was a little bit rough around the edges. It's true.
Yeah.
but really, who do you think started the American Revolution? And John Brown, you know, like, you don't think John Brown would have executed some people? Come on. So
I think that there's actually a lot more truth in comparing Jefferson to these characters than a lot of these Tea Partier people want to admit. Like, I'm sorry, right. Like it's a very unsavory history. I don't want to get into that, but I mean, there are some similarities between these people, like even Antifa and these Sons of Liberty people from the 18th century.
Oh, for sure. And if you look at like Antifa and Buonarroti or the Carbonari or any of those 19th century European secret societies, which had very good friends in the top layers of society and, financial backers and so on, there's a lot of similarities. Of course, history repeats itself usually as farce. And so your typical transgender, Antifa dude covered in herpes scabs, Buonarroti would have probably been like, get away from me, don't touch me, and like hit him with a cane or something. But when you look at the way that they operated and their basic view of the world and what is good in life, it's very similar. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, why did this stuff all come to a head in the 50s? Why did the Birch Society, like, there's two stories here. Okay, one story is that the American state has basically a second parallel state in it. And while the American state is like, listen, guys, we love democracy and freedom and prosperity and fluffy little golden retriever puppies and everything that's nice and warm and fuzzy, this parallel kind of state, which you could say is distributed across academia and the government and NGOs and the media, is like, well, actually, what we like is anarchy and mass murder and forced starvation and, whatever the craziest, most evil shit you've got, that's what we want. Oh, Sunni jihadists, we'd like those. Shia jihadists, we'd like those too. Commies, whatever, man. Even Nazis, to some degree. There was a good book by Anthony Sutton called Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, where a lot of these guys were like, yeah, this Hitler fella, he's, well, if you think about it, he's also kind of a Jeffersonian Democrat with some rough edges. You got to understand.
From my understanding, go ahead.
So there's like the story of this state and like this whole like it's kind of like a telenovela, right? Like a Mexican romantic comedy where every freaking episode is the same episode, basically. Or like a pro wrestling, show. And there's also the story of the people writing about them, which was the Birch Society. And I guess you could say McCarthy had his brief like spell, and then, all the way to neo reaction. So why was there this spike of like horrified outrage, which was then slowly kind of suppressed and driven underground right when there was? That's my question.
Okay. So first of all, I would love to, I won't have enough time probably today, but I would love to discuss like Brown and the Secret Six at some point, because but I think that if you look at American history, what always happens is that, if you read about like the Civil War stuff and the lead up to it, there is a robust disagreement between the Southerners and the Northerners on fundamental things. But when the South got defeated, the sort of the unionist view by and large became the default one to where, but if you look at the lead up to that, it's just as grimy as the stuff that we're talking about. Like there's not as many bodies.
Yeah, the Jayhawks, bloody Kansas,
James Lane, that whole thing is just vile. But okay, so the side lost in the same way that and that became the default American view. And I think what happens with all this stuff is that it's like people just are like, well, I didn't sign up for this, but they accepted all this other stuff, not because the conflict ended and it's sort of like the winner's view became normalized. So they don't view and discuss, like, if they had, been growing up around the time of this stuff, they would have very different views, but those people died off. But each time there is a kind of like cultural civil war, and the more powerful side, which is sadly always the Owen Lattimore, Frederick Vanderbilt field side, always prevails. And then the older people, like, if you read about the right-wing stuff before, like, even World War I or World War II, it's completely insane how different it is. And that's kind of why I also like the Birchers, because they were smart enough to, and like well-read enough, these people who wrote these Dozen Candles books, to kind of understand the America that existed before, even if I don't agree with their conclusions. But what sort of frustrates me about the right today is that they don't even have, like, by and large, the historical perspective to where, like, the stuff that we're talking about, like, they don't even think about it that way. They're just like, no, this is like...
Everything was good until 1965.
Yeah. Like, and it's just like, no, man, that's not... Like,
or maybe 1995.
But I guess to answer your question, if you're saying, why did this take off during the...
why did the counter-narrative, yeah.
Well, I think it's because, it's kind of weird. Like, when you look at these wars like Iraq or Vietnam or whatever today, and supposedly we can't win them, it's like in World War II, by and large, the bureaucratic State Department types were able to work effectively with the military types. That doesn't happen today. Now today, they're always trying to sabotage each other, and the State Department eventually prevails. But in World War II, they were allied, and eventually at the end of it, like, the people like Forrestal or Patton or like MacArthur were either, recalled, or they were just possibly assassinated or whatever. But there was sort of a unity because it was a new form of government. Like, it's like the New Deal was so radical that became the new norm. But eventually, of course, these people, now they don't have, the Germans got defeated, the Japanese got defeated, Italy was a joke. So now they have to, like, now that their common cause is done, they sort of branch off. And now the war's over and it's not a way to unite Americans. I think Americans started to ask questions like, well, wait, we won the war. Why are these evil, horrible, disgusting regimes that we are against, but we were for in the war, are like just grabbing territory with both hands and like one of their feet? Like, in World War II, you didn't ask those questions because that's not how wars work. You don't question the prevailing. But after the war ended, these like rapacious, like people in government, they were using the same tactics to basically do in peacetime, more or less, what they were doing in wartime. And I think people were starting to, like, I don't know if that makes sense to you, but you would agree that in a war, like in a serious war that all engines like of propaganda and stuff are just talking about people, there's not a lot of questioning of like
the main narrative,
the prevailing narrative. I mean,
yeah, maybe Huns don't eat babies, or maybe Huns eat babies, but so do communists. So, right, it's a question of chicken and the egg, right? There's a guy named Norman Dodd who was a Wall Street guy, and he was the chief investigator for the I believe the Reese Committee, which
the foundations one. That guy rules.
Yeah. So, right. So the Reese Committee was established by Congress back when Congress was not just a bunch of basically geriatrics, to investigate how foundations influence American life, like in all its aspects, American politics, American education, and so on. Of course, back then there was no Gates Foundation, which I guess influences like American medical, policy. Yeah. But there were other foundations that were tax exempt, but they were huge. And so Dodd,
Ford, Rockefeller,
yeah, exactly. And so Dodd was a chief investigator for this committee, and he was a pretty serious guy. He'd been a banker. He was an intellectual. And so he had his people running around looking at stuff. His interviews are actually available on YouTube, and he's a real pleasure to listen to because he speaks this perfect, like Andover Academy, Yale, like early 20th century English, which compared to that, the English that we speak is kind of orc-like grunting. I mean, just a pleasure to listen to. And by this point, he's in the 70s
American
or 80s.
English.
Yes. Yeah, sure.
Gas station loiterer English.
Yes. Yes. But even back then, I have the feeling that the guy that would fill up your gas would be speaking kind of Andover English a lot of times.
He would sound like he went to
or Faulkner.
School.
Or Faulkner English. Faulkner like dialect, but at a high level. So Dodd is at this point in the 70s or in his 80s, but he's very, very clearly he's present. He's not spazzing out. He's not Alex Jonesing out or dimensioning out. And he says, listen, I sent one of my investigators down to the Carnegie Foundation, and she was kind of one of these very straight-laced normie ladies that was like, well, we're just on a wild goose chase here. And she came back and she was kind of psychologically broken because the guy in charge of the archives at the Carnegie Foundation, this was in the 1950s, was some goober who was like, yeah, sure, go look around in the archives. And she went down and she found the minutes of a meeting in, I think, 1912, right, where the Carnegie Foundation folks said, okay, well, how can we implement permanent changes to American internal policy and change basically the fabric of American society? And the answer they came up was we need a war, a big war, and then the next question was how do we get America involved in the war? And then next thing you know, 4 years later, America's involved in the war over the Lusitania, which is a whole separate story, how the Lusitania gets sunk, and that the Lusitania wasn't exactly a civilian vessel. It was carrying a ton of ammo, et cetera, so forth. Anyway, and this lady came back and she was like, I don't want to do this anymore. This is bad, I pulled a little tentacle and then this whole giant thing came out of the sea and, and then they sent somebody down to the Ford Foundation, and Gaithner, I think Rowan Gaithner was running it at the time, was very straightforward. He said, listen, we're running, the guys that are running these foundations, we were all in the OSS and OWI during the war, and we kept doing what we were doing during the war, after the war, in these foundations. And this stuff is coming from the National Executive Authority, the president's level, So all the stuff about us, subverting American society or transforming American society, it's happening. We're doing it. That's our job, and that's what's going to happen. So the question, there was also a great book called by a bunch of revisionist historians called "Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace," edited by Harry Elmer Barnes.
Yes,
and it was like 6 or 8 different essays. It's a very good book. Some of those guys. Again, they're revisionists. I can't agree with everything they write, but one thing they wrote, this was published in the 50s or 60s, was that America during the Cold War was effectively in a wartime status in peacetime, where they had bases in 100-something countries. They were running active military ops in a dozen countries, and it was kind of on a wartime footing. And it was also on a wartime footing internally, where you had your kids, were growing up in Cornhole, Ohio, and doing duck and cover nuclear drills for when the Ruskies were going to start dropping nukes on them. Never mind the Ruskies, didn't have very many nukes, and the ones they had, was a big question whether they would fly in the general right direction and land on the right continent, but whatever. So, as you said, during a war, that's one of the advantages of a war. Expressing doubts about the prevailing narrative and about the enemy's, pure evil and your friend's pure goodness is treason. Maybe legally, maybe just kind of morally. And nobody likes a traitor. And that's the wonderful thing about a war, because you don't have all these traitors getting in the way of you amassing money and power and rebuilding your society in the shape that you would like. Sure. Yeah. But then after the war, as you said, after the war, right, you can't keep that up 20 years straight, right? So and then you had the Iron Curtain, you had the Cold War start, and it turned out that the Soviets weren't these like Jeffersonian Democrats with some rough edges. After all, they were actually the incarnation of pure evil, as bad as Hitler, maybe even worse.
They were Samuel Adams Democrats. They were a little bit rough. They might burn down your entire kingdom business, but they were, if you didn't take their fake paper money, but they were still, they were good guys. Like they were going to, a lot of people don't know this, but Stalin was turning his life around. He was going to get a GED. He stole, because a lot of the money he stole, like from Spain, those gold bars, he was using that to buy textbooks so he could go and get his GED so he could do urban planning.
He was going to open a record label for a traditional Georgian song and dance videos. Yeah. Actually, they're very rhythmic. The Georgians, the Mingrels and the Laws and so on. So, yeah. But like 1948, it turns out like, hey, these guys are bad dudes after all. And then, so like in one of those like 180-degree bootlegger turns, and then in the 1950s, it turns out, well, the 60s, well, if these guys are actually the bad guys after all, then why are we throwing our allies under the bus so these guys can eat them alive? And this was like the Birch Society's thing, right?
Yes.
And obviously the answer was like Fidel Castro's nefarious, sophisticated foreign intelligence apparatuses penetrated Yale and Harvard and Columbia.
Yeah, it's just absurd. Okay, I am delighted that you mentioned the foundations. I just want to add a couple of things. I have not read the minutes from that. I am familiar. There's, I think, a website called Scribd, and I don't know if that's a UR link, but I have heard that the minutes from the Reese Committee are great. I have not read them. I did read Renee Wormser, who was sort of what I would call a Bircher adjacent guy, and he wrote this amazing book called
Non-Call of Treason, right? None-Call of Treason. Did he write none?
No, that's John. That's John Stormer. I have not.
Sorry.
I actually have. Renee Wormser was on the Reese Committee, and his book. It's called Foundations, and the author's name is Wormser, and it's incredible. And it talks about rewriting textbooks. It talks about how they will have conservatives on the board who don't know what the people, as you say, are doing, like the archive goover. They have it there for plausible deniability. But one of the things in Foundations that really just struck me was apparently one of these foundations, I don't remember if it was the Ford or the Carnegie or the Rockefeller one, but they were trying to decide to do away with American jury duties because I guess they were concerned that Americans, if they heard communists on trial, the juries would be more inclined to just not like them because they're trying to destroy their entire way of life and put them in a gulag.
Yeah, so that's a problem.
One of these foundations actually put recording equipment in jury deliberation rooms and listened to their verdicts, and they were going to make a recommendation to eliminate so they were listening to this stuff. I don't know how this is legal, but I'm not making this up. If you read Renee Wormser's book, you will come across this. I remember he talked about Harold Rugg, who rewrote the American textbooks and just thought they, just did all this ridiculous pro-communist stuff. But I also want to just add one quick thing. When you talked about the Milner Group and so on, like the Institute of Pacific Relations was a sort of offshoot of the Inquiry, which is the same thing that you're talking about, but it's sort of a precursor to the Council of Foreign Relations, which was made by what was that guy's name who was Wilson's little
Colonel House?
Yeah, Edward House. Yes. He made that with all these people. But it was the same idea as the Milner Group. As you said, it was, we're going to guide society. I also wanted to just add, I'm delighted you read the Harry Elmer Barnes thing. His essay, The Historical Blackout, if you want to just learn about all these great World War II books, just read World War II and the Historical Blackout in Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, and just look at all the old books he recommends. There's probably like 20-something of them. They're all worth reading, like Charles Callan Tansel's Backdoor to War, Charles Beard's one. you will get a education on World War II that exceeds like, it's the diplomatic history, but it's just incredible, mind-blowing stuff. Sanborn's Design for War. Like, I think this should be like mandatory reading if you want to understand World War II. And I'm very happy that you've read all this stuff, man. Like, I know you've given me some good book recs, but like, thank you for mentioning on your show, because I want people to read this stuff. You can go on Archive and read a lot of it. It's worth reading. It takes some time, but it's worth reading, man.
So there are stories within stories here. I want to take a break for a couple of minutes, and then when we come back, I want to discuss because what you have here is sort of like the tale of the blind man and the elephant, right?
Yes.
Times a million. There are facts, and there's definitely some kind of narrative that shapes through them, and then what that narrative is kind of up to interpretation. And there's stories within stories within stories here. So I wanna probably take a break for a minute, and then when we come back, I wanna discuss one of those stories, which is the British angle, which we've kind of touched on a little bit, but there's more to discuss. So let me pause this recording here. So there are like stories within stories within stories here. And of course, the larger stories are made up of the lives of people and various subgroups that would form and develop and decay and fall apart. One story that's very interesting is from World War II. Basically, well, it goes back to before World War II. We mentioned Milner's Kindergarten, which was a secret society that had been founded by Cecil Rhodes before he died, then fell into the hands of basically senior British academics and imperial bureaucrats and intelligence people and aristocrats. These people were heavily aristocratic, that were centered on Oxford, on one of the colleges of Oxford. This was kind of their intellectual center of gravity. And these guys basically were a secret society. Their original goal was to sort of unite the world under a British Empire. That's what Rhodes wanted. But then they came around over the succeeding decades to the idea that the British Empire actually had to fall apart, which it was already doing, and then be subsumed into sort of a larger global empire. And so they pioneered things like the Round Table discussion groups and various publications were, similar to Foreign Affairs. And they had branches in all of the British dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, of course, and so on. But America was sort of its own thing. America had broken away from the British Empire, and with the exception of the East Coast elite, was pretty distant from it. In terms of policy, in some ways, although with the Monroe Doctrine, you saw America basically being a security subcontractor for the Western Hemisphere for Britain.
Yes.
In terms of economics, in terms of culture, British society was a very hierarchical society in terms of class. The guys running it came from a very kind of a specific substrate of it, although of course people would rise into it through meritocracy and so on. It's funny that the most recent thing that Britain's in the news for is the grooming gangs, which have been going on for decades. Of course, the Pakistani grooming gangs. But the yeah. When you look into it, though, I mean, the Pakistanis weren't doing anything that hadn't been going on in British elite circles. God knows how long. Of course, you had Jimmy Savile, who seems to have been some sort of procurer of children to molest for high-placed people in Britain. He was sort of like a domestic Epstein type. You had the Kincora Children's Home, where they had a state-run children's home, and they were pimping these kids out to prominent Brits. You had a British MP, Sir Cyril Smith, I believe, who was famous for this stuff, and so on, and so forth. So what I'm saying is Britain was a completely different kettle of fish from America. You had similar stuff going on in America, but it was less, I guess, perhaps institutionalized. And one of these guys' sort of priorities, Milner's kindergarten, was how do you get America on board? America is not part of the same class system. America is much more dynamic. America has many more people than Britain itself, and many more resources, a continent's worth of resources, and tremendous industry, and so on, and so forth. So they got the U.S. on board during World War I, obviously. America exported a tremendous amount of weapons to the Allies even before it joined the war in 1916. 1917, excuse me. But then after the war, how do you get them back on board? And there's an excellent book, which perhaps you've read, called Desperate Deception, which
by Thomas Mall.
Perhaps I don't remember the author's name.
Go ahead. No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry.
Sure. Which describes something called the British Security Coordination, which was a full-blown British intelligence agency. Its support functions were in Canada, in Ottawa, but it was operating in the U.S. From 1940 to 1941, I believe, maybe 1941, with the full backing of part of the American East Coast elite, and its aim was to get America into World War II on the side of the Brits. They had their headquarters in the U.S. was an entire floor of the Rockefeller Center, which Rockefeller made available to them, I think at no charge. They had guys like they had very, very impressive guys like Roald Dahl, who had gotten shot up as a pilot flying for the Royal Air Force, and then came over here and was working on basically getting America on board. And what these guys were doing was running a full-scale propaganda and recruiting and subversion campaign to take America from its stance of like, listen, Europe's got another terrible war going on and we want nothing to do with it, to, well, we've got to save Britain from the Nazis, who are the worst. And they succeeded at it. So one of the things that they did was they built, a lot of these guys came from the SIS, and they built the OSS, which later on became the CIA, and they built it basically in the image of the British intelligence services. There was a guy named Dick Ellis, who was the deputy head of the British Security Coordination, who had been a British intelligence officer. He was working for a guy named William Stevenson, who was featured. A book was written about him called A Man Called Intrepid, who had been running British intelligence in the U.S. in World War I as well. And there are many interesting stories there involving connections to Trotsky and so on. Anyway, the normal story is that, Wild Bill Donovan, who had been a Congressional Medal of Honor winner during World War I, and then was a Wall Street lawyer, basically built the OSS out of spun it out of like whole cloth, right? And used existing Wall Street and private intelligence services and so on and so forth. And that's part of the story, but really Donovan was not a huge intelligence guy. And these guys really stood up the OSS and kind of built out American foreign intelligence, which was in a very nascent state before World War II. and then from here on, the story is kind of, these are all facts. Like, this is not in dispute. From here on, the story kind of goes into the realm of speculation and conspiracy theories, and the idea that there was kind of an international elite whose power center moved from the city of London to the east coast of the U.S. after World War II, and that it went from kind of British bankers to American lawyers and Wall Street types here. And then this kind of merges into the post World War II story of which the Birch people were writing about. So I wanted to ask you to speak to that. What have you come across in your reading?
Okay, so first of all, I think you know more about the Milner Group. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, the Milner Group. I've obviously heard about Jimmy Savile. I can't speak about the grooming stuff like, that you mentioned. But what I will say about the British in terms of their diminishing role or whatever, there was a book called, I've read Anthony Sutton's book. In my opinion, I don't think that the reason that Russia went to Bolsheviks was some Wall Street ploy. Really, the bankers kept loaning the USSR money and eventually went bankrupt. I don't know if they ever got their pound of flesh, so to speak, from the USSR. But my point is just that if you read about, in World War I, for instance, there's this book called America's Road to War. And it just talks about how the British treated American ships. I think that, Germany was buying, I think, a lot of American cotton, and the British basically forbid Americans from delivering cotton so a lot of prominent people would put a bale of cotton on their doorstep to show solidarity with the Southerners, like the Southern Democrats. But the British would stop American ships in World War I and just search them and just treat them as a world power would treat, lessers. And they would just be like, hey, what do you have in here? Do you have anything in this? When you get to World War II, and I just want to add
you faded out.
Ambassador.
Say it again, please.
Walter Hines Page, the American ambassador to Britain in World War I, he kind of, I feel got manipulated by the British powers to sort of lead the U.S. in. And when Edward House went to Britain, you feel like he might be out of his depth. And, these Milner Group people, these financiers, Edward House.
Sorry, you're fading out.
Oh, okay.
Let's start again. When House went to Britain, you felt he was out of his depth. His depth, yeah.
I don't think that he fully. I think he was he was the lesser partner in that relationship.
Was it House or was it Mandel?
I don't know who Mandel is. House was Wilson's I don't remember his official position, but he was sort of his little manservant.
Oh, sorry, Edward Mandel House. That was his name.
Okay, yeah, all right, yeah. But by the time World War II rolls around, you don't see the UK is bowing to the US because they had faded from top power, and the US, they can't search the US ships now. Now they have to beg us. They're like, oh, can you please there's that Charles Beard book about just how the US and the UK, I have not read Desperate Deception by Maul. I'm going to read it. I'm going to look up the Dodd interviews after this is over. But yes, the UK desperately wanted the US to join World War II, but I don't think they roped us into it. I think FDR and these Eastern people you talk about absolutely had the same goal. And I don't think that I think they just wanted it. But the UK by World War II and the 40s, they don't view the U.S. You can't just search the U.S. ships. Now you kind of have to come hat in hand type thing, if that makes sense. So as far as that goes, I love the Anthony Sutton book, but in my opinion, I don't think that that like the financiers are what caused the fall of the Soviet Union. I still think it was like I know Yarvin has recommended that Samuel Harper, the Russia I Believe in book, which is great. It's a diary of this guy who was a Charles Crane protege.
Mm-hmm.
But I know you've read quite a bit about, I know you're not a particularly fan of the Russian elite because it's like I think the way you phrased it, from what I recall, was you said they sort of went from anti-German paranoia to anti-Jew paranoia. And that's caused them to purge their best people and do suicidally stupid people.
Well, the Russian elite, when you read memoirs of people that were up there rubbing elbows with them but weren't them,
Yes.
basically the Russian elite was sort of like, I think P. Diddy is about the closest that I can describe the Russian elite. Like that scene, the scene of like rappers and various black entertainment figures around Diddy, that's basically what those guys acted like. So it's not one particular policy or another. It's their general low level of human capital, just how insanely dumb and backwards they were and degenerate, which is how they lost their empire. But Crane is another fascinating character, right? We should discuss him as well. Perhaps the next time, but hugely.
He's like Soros.
I think Soros is kind of a bumpkin Hungarian Jewish version of Crane.
Soros is a pygmy compared to
Yeah. Crane was far more like. I mean, I think
because Crane did it in the Middle East and in Russia.
Yes, right. Crane did it in the Middle East and in Russia, and Crane was also the American version of an aristocrat. Whereas Soros is some, shopkeeper's grandson or whatever it is, So, but yeah, so you're very much right that by World War II, things had shifted. So the Russia I Believe in was the book
by Samuel Harper. And again, I found this. I just kept finding old stuff that Yarvin, because I was so fascinated by the idea that the U.S. and I'm fully on board with this now, especially in light of what we've said for Cuba and China, which is it's the same pattern with Russia and Mexico. But yes, Yarvin recommends a bunch of. I forget where I think he did it on the Michael Malice thing, but it's a great diary. It's called The Russia I Believe in by Samuel Harper. A lot of the names we mentioned, like Charles Beard, they'll come back. It's a great diary. If you've read Sutton, as I know you have, it will tie into a bunch of stuff. It will fill in some blanks. Why is this random academic guy talking to all these Duma people who are going to overthrow the Tsar? First of all, why does he even know them if he's just some, don't mind me, I'm just some academic? David Francis of the State Department, who was there in 1916, he wrote diaries that are great on the fall of Russia. The autobiography of Raymond Robbins is probably my favorite piece of 20th century propaganda. You will laugh out loud when you read this book. It's just pure propaganda, pure Bolshevik propaganda. It's hilarious. It fits into all this stuff.
The Bolsheviks were, let me guess, they were Jeffersonian Democrats, rough around the edges. What does the Russia I Believe in book say?
Well, it's about this guy who was there. He went there under Charles Crane's aegis, and he's just like, I went there and I talked to Pavel Milyukov, and this is the guy who was openly calling for Nicholas's wife. What was her name? Alexandrova. Like the German, the people they accused of being a German traitor. But there's a great book. If you read The Russia I Believe in, you should read Sean McMeekin's The Russian Revolution. Sean McMeekin is, to me, one of the best and most honorable historians involving World War I and World War II today. But Samuel Harper is friends with all these people that overthrew initially. These are not the outright Bolsheviks. These are like the Duma people.
The first revolution.
Yeah. Rodzianko types. Yeah. Rodzianko types, Pavel Milyukov. And of course, these people didn't have the balls or the talent they just decided to overthrow this very flawed czar. But then when they saw this stuff, they're like, well, wait a second, I don't know how to do this. And it's like, whoa, do you think you should have like learned? It's like killing the in the middle of a heart surgery. You just you take frog march the surgeon out of the room and zip tie him, and they're like, okay, so how are we going to put the heart in? And well, wait, I don't know how to do that. That sounds hard. That's like what these Duma people and Kerensky also. I have a lot of contempt for him because it's like, man, I don't know what. I'm not saying the czar was not full of flaws, but it's like you pretty much just screwed over all these people. I don't know. I'm sorry.
Well, the people that forced the czar's abdication, aside from Milyukov and all these kind of leftists in the Duma, were also members of the royal family.
Yes,
I don't remember which.
They were also very poor leaders too.
Yeah, they all sucked. So, but what was the Russia, I believe, what was the American role in it? Were these guys kind of coming over and whispering in people's ear and promising them that they would support them and so on and so forth?
Well, it doesn't because it's a diary in the same way that if you read the Dean Acheson autobiography, I've talked to you about the Institute of Pacific Relations, but there's a picture in the Dean Acheson autobiography, a photograph of him sitting in a car with Philip Jessup of the Institute of Pacific Relations. And this is the guy that was obviously telling the president to ditch Chiang and give China to Mao. And, he was obviously basically doing all this stuff, but Acheson was his friend. But Acheson never admits any of this. Like, he's just like, his chapters like these redneck retards were just going after my friends. And for Samuel Harper, he's not going to put in his diary. He's not going to let himself get that dirty.
He's not going to self-incriminate, yeah.
Yeah, he just happens to know all these revolutionaries, but why is he talking to him? Like, what is he saying to him? Like, I just went to some meeting. That doesn't mean I'm, that's just okay, Baruch, like you've been to another country and you see like some political rally, and when you go there, they just let you talk to the top people, and it's totally normal, and you're their friends. Like, that's totally how life works. So Harper's like diary sort of reads like that, and it's just fascinating because these people don't incriminate themselves. But if you read his diary and you're like, how do you even know all these people? And then he's like a protege of Charles Crane. You're like, okay, so this doesn't smell right. Like,
you're over there working.
Yeah, like I'm just over there like I'm trying to play a game of guess the czar. Like, okay, this czar was then, so I want to know the czar before him. I'm writing a AP U.S. history course where I'm trying to name all the czars. Like it's absurd.
Right.
Like,
well, when you look at how I read a very good article about it on Scribd or however you pronounce it, talking about the OSS and the academic part of the OSS. That some huge part of the OSS came from academia, anthropologists and sociologists and all the cultural studies and area studies people. And then after the war, some of them stayed on in the CIA, some of them went off to work in academia while probably still working for the CIA, and so on and so forth. One of my favorite physical anthropologists was a guy named Carlton Kuhn, who wrote really fascinating books on, anthropology and fossils, and we would run around.
What civilization did he fixate? What civilization or part of the world did he fixate on?
He really didn't. He was global in scope. He taught in Yale.
Okay.
He had very, very beautifully illustrated books. He was out there measuring people's heads with calipers and so on.
He was a phrenologist?
He was a physical anthropologist. He was not a phrenologist.
Okay. No, he I didn't mean that as a slur. I was just curious. No, that's cool.
No, he wasn't going this bump on the Yazidis' head like, is what makes him so honest in their business dealings. No, but he did go, the average relationship between, the width of their face and the height of their face. And from this, he would go and extrapolate, all the way back to Homo erectus, people were broken down to races and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, during World War II, he just kind of shifts gears and becomes the OSS chief of station in Algiers, I believe. And the whole Darlan thing was him, anyway, and then after the war, he writes basically a proposal like, how do we have a secret global empire for what then becomes the CIA, and so on and so forth. So what I'm saying is that there are areas like academia and press and a couple of other ones where the people working there are basically fulfilling an intelligence function in some way, even if they're just doing their job. But it also lends itself perfectly to cover for intelligence. This guy's just doing research. That's why he knows all these people. That's why he's interviewing them. That's why he's having conversations. Okay. Yeah, maybe. Maybe not, right?
Well, so, okay, I also want to just talk about, because you were talking about the bankers and stuff, but a very sort of hilarious and perhaps pitiful sort of contemporary of Frederick Vanderbilt Field was this guy named Corliss Lamont. Now, Corliss Lamont was sort of...
Is he related to Ned Lamont?
He was related to the banker Thomas Lamont, who was, I forget which bank it was. This is a Wall Street heavy hitter.
Morgan.
Yeah, negotiating like some of the like post-World War I peace deals. This is his son. This is a communist. Again, yeah, like not the dirty, scruffy type. Like this is a guy who comes from blue blood, as many of these people do, regardless of whether the shall we say the like lower IQ contingents of the right, they want to pretend like this is some foreign thing or whatever. But okay, so like for instance, I think it was anyway, he was the attack dog. There's that Eugene Lyons, The Red Decade book, and Corliss Lamont is always the attack dog, always towing like the stall.
Sorry, you say again, please.
If someone like in the like the 30s, if someone is questioning in the Communist Party, like Dewey or something, the assassination of Trotsky, and he's like, well, this doesn't add up. This guy, Corliss Lamont, will just attack them. And he is a great face to show, because the communists are like, well, this is a smart, reasonable young man. And he's just clearly sees. But his father, Thomas Lamont, was a banker who was plugged into the top echelons of government. And apparently, I have not read his autobiography, but Frederick Vanderbilt Field mentions him in his autobiography. But this guy is, his dad did not have any ill feelings toward him. They basically were on the same page. Like, this is a weirder, I think this century is a lot weirder than people give it credit for. Like, it's not, certainly the Marxist thing, like, oh, it's just the little people who are Marxists and they're allied against the big institutions. It doesn't line up that way. Like, it's not like that at all. Like, in fact, it's sort of like the Birchers are the little people. These, in fact, I think that, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, they're Hicks. They're Hicks questioning their social superiors.
Yeah, and there's sort of a thing with Atchison and all these people, because Atchison worked with Alger Hiss, and there's a really great Bircher book that I think every book that we've mentioned, I would hope that anyone listening to this will just read all these books, because they're all worth your time. But there's a book by Ralph Toledano. It's one of the 12 Candles books, and it's about Alger Hiss. I think it's called Seeds of Treason. But, he is not like, if you read Whittaker Chambers, he's sort of just, he is not this fringe person. He just goes around like a ping pong ball between all these New Deal organizations. He is like not a fringe figure. When he went to prison, apparently there's a quote he said, and apparently he had contempt for FDR because FDR was not like communist enough for his taste. He was not woke enough, which is a normal thing but he said in prison, I forget which prison he was in, but apparently he said something like, if the old man was still alive, I would not be in prison. And again, I just want to stress that for all the stuff we're talking about, like, you have to kind of read between the lines. You have to do your own detective work. People, even very guilty people, are not going to just lay this all out. Like, they will write it favorable to themselves. But if you read enough of this stuff and you connect enough of these names, you can start to see, like, in my opinion, like, okay, I know you're lying to me, but I can still, like, I can still use your source to extrapolate and figure out what's going on based on previous stuff I've read. And sadly, the 20th century, because it's so recent and our regime is built on it, it's always going to be like that. But you just have to do your own legwork. You have to read outright propaganda. It's usually very funny and entertaining if enough time's passed, because it just sounds corny. But I would strongly recommend reading old, like, communist or Wilsonian propaganda or any. But if you just don't lose your head, you can learn a lot, and you just have to realize these people are not here to, like, they're here to mislead you, but because enough time has passed and the party line has changed, you can very obviously see how they're lying, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of stuff that sounded convincing at the time, just with context, it becomes kind of more or less clear what was going on. Okay, cool. So I think we're getting close to 2 hours. I suggest we cut it here.
I'm sorry I've kept you on so long with my ranting, man.
Wonderful. I'm sure the audience will love it. We will try to put together a list of books that were mentioned in this conversation, at least a partial list with links to Amazon or online where you can read them. And see for yourself. And hopefully we can do this again and pick maybe a more specific book and spend our conversation kind of digging down in it. In any case, I had a great time, and let's do this again.
I did too. Thank you for having me on, sir.
Thank you, sir. All right.